part of the presentation, I'm trying to show you the connections in the characteristics of the technology, in the process of innovation in general, and the social and the political characteristics as measured by the levels of statism and corporatism, and bringing these together in a meaningful way to understand cross-national variations in approaches to innovation. So this is again a quick summary of the various characteristics of fuel cells. There are at least 9 different types of fuel cells. They range from the low temperature to the very high temperature fuel cells, going right up to 1000 degrees Celsius. That's a solid oxide fuel cell. What is interesting is that even as the oldest fuel cells, like the alkaline fuel cells, are still around and are still being researched, these fuel cells, by the way, were used to power the Gemini spacecraft. There are other fuel cells like the regenerative fuel cell and the zinc air fuel cell and the protonic ceramic fuel cell, which are being developed in the US. And we see the most diversity. I don't want to give away too much of my, the spike of my, or the spice of my talk, but we see very different orientations. We see very different propensities in terms of which types of technologies and the range of technologies that are being developed across these different countries. So this is just to give you a quick snapshot and also to highlight that fuel cells have many attractive attributes, but they also have certain problems at this stage related to the cost of platinum, related to the competition with existing technologies. As fuel cells are increasing their power densities and their efficiencies to almost 50%, the existing technologies are also taking those strides forward, which is making it even harder for fuel cells to become competitive. This is what tomorrow's car might look like, and as you can see, almost all manufacturers in the world, at least the major ones, have a fuel cell car, which is either in the demonstration phase or in the testing phase. So in a few years down the road, your children or grandchildren will be sitting in one of those high wires right there, okay? And not gassing up on gasoline, but gassing up on hydrogen, and not buying it by the gallon, but buying it by the kilogram. So, so here's my research outline in terms of having given you this background. I want to show you where I'm going next. So I've made the argument that there is a case to look at how innovation differs across countries based on the social and political characteristics of these countries. To define the social and political characteristics of these countries, I have used the statist and the corporatist lens, which suggests the extent to which interest groups are organized or fragmented, and the extent to which government plays a highly coordinated role or coordinating role versus whether interests emerge in a more bottom-up kind of manner. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to try and validate this typology that I showed you earlier. Is it true that we can actually see systematic differences across country groups based on key dimensions of technology policies? And once I establish that, yes, indeed, we can see some systematic differences across these country groupings, liberal, pluralist, and social corporatist, and state nation, and so on, I will try and examine the relevance of this polity type to a specific industry sector, which is the fuel cell innovation domain. So I will do that based on a case study of fuel cell innovation in 4 countries, the US, Japan, France, and Norway, which are the exemplars of the 4 polity types that we talked about. And these polity types are based on whether you're high or low on statism and corporatism. And finally, having demonstrated the applicability of this social, political, institutional lens at the level of an industry, I will go on to talk about how these variations have salience for firms' knowledge-building strategies, both in the context of knowledge acquisition and knowledge diffusion. To do this, I'm relying on an inductive methodology. So I'm not beginning with a hypothesis or a theory. Rather, I'm carrying out a case-based analysis to come up with an emergent theory. So it's really a grounded theory-building approach, which has been used quite extensively in prior literature. Of course, to do this, I have not had to travel into the jungles of East Timor or roam in the deserts of Burkina Faso like our previous speaker did. But I just sat on my desk and went through thousands of reports, sifting through information, policy reports. I also interviewed a few people, mostly managers from firms. I had close interaction with the Fuel Cell Association, the industry association in Washington, D.C., where I was based when I was doing this research. And finally, my past work as an energy policy analyst came quite handy in doing this analysis because I had a background in energy technology and in energy policy. So in essence, this is a paper which I have written based on a case-based method rather than my other papers, which are very empirical and very deductive in their approach. So, but I find that this is a more interesting and more in-depth paper because it really helps me also understand the theoretical basis for the other work that I'm doing, which is more empirical. So, as I promised, I'm showing you some of the variations across these 4 polity types, across key dimensions. So, if we ask, how does financing vary across these polity types? And this is data that I've got from the most recent OECD report on science technology indicators. You can see that there is a large difference in terms of the extent to which the government investment happens in civil R&D, and this is only civil R&D. This is not military R&D. And you can see that the percentage of government investment in civil R&D is the highest for countries that are corporatist. So either social corporatist or state corporatist. The more corporatist a country, the more government investment in civil R&D. And this, I suspect, has something to do with the fact that corporatist countries, by virtue of their organizational capabilities, are in a better position to negotiate deals with the government. And the government also can dole out resources to one group without causing confrontations and disturbances across the industry as a whole. If you look at percentage of R&D financed by the venture capital industry, you'll find that the maximum venture capital investment happens in either the liberal pluralist countries or the social corporatist countries, which suggests that the lower the degree of statism in a country, the more the venture capital investment in that country, the more private sector participation in that country. So the participation of private venture capital is positively related, based on these facts, with the degree of societal nature of country, that is lower statism. And the degree of government investment is positively related with the level of corporatism in a particular country. If we look at collaboration across polities, we observe that there is the greatest collaboration happening in the more corporatist countries, with the maximum collaboration happening in the social corporatist countries. And if you look at percentage of firms collaborating with the government, that is also the greatest for firms in social corporatist countries. So it's not a surprise that corporatist countries which perpetuate greater collaboration and greater coordination are also contributing to greater firm collaboration.
Nita, in the last slide you broke down the venture capital contribution and government contribution. What could you quickly refresh our memories about what the other contributions would have been? They would have been from bank loans or What sources?
Well, I mean, the investments could come from either corporate venture, internal corporate venturing, or they could, so there isn't a lot of institutional investment happening at this point in this industry. So the investment is either internally through corporate venturing or externally through venture capital investment or coming from the government. So those would be the three main sources of investment at this point.
So the internal investment is bigger in non-corporatist societies.
There is a greater deal of government investment in corporatist societies. So yes, in non-corporatist societies there will be more of corporate venturing. So internal investment, internal R&D commitments, as well as public equity. So a lot of companies have gone public in countries like the US in this particular industry.
I don't want to hold you up here, but it suddenly occurred to me, I worked on an article 25 years ago about something roughly having to do with this, and it goes, it's a theorem that goes back to Nancy Olson about public goods, that the total size of the total size of the economy, as well as perhaps per capita income, should be variables that determine part of this. And has there, I don't, you've got just these tables. Have, you know, is there a regression that sort of determines this? And
not in this paper. Yeah. There is a regression in my other paper, which is doing a large data analysis of the relationship between corporatism and knowledge outcomes based on the size of the country and the intellectual.
So does the size? Capital. So does the total size of the country not turn out to be a significant factor in terms of just something very crude like GDP?
I think there is a lot of variation. So if you look at the last slide, state nations here in terms of, if you look at percentage of government investment, even though state nations are not ranking that high, and state nations here are countries like France and Italy, and there are also smaller countries in there, like Greece, for example, which are in terms of per capita investment in fuel cells are not very large. We see a large deviation, a large variation within the subgrouping. So some countries, so there is going to be some variation in terms of these characteristics that we are seeing. Some countries will be larger than the others, and there is a mix of countries here. There are both large and small countries. But if you look at the averages, you will find that there is a systematic ranking here, which you can infer. So this is in terms of taking the first step in trying to assess if these groupings are really showing us anything at all based on simple means across these different technology policy dimensions, without going into regressions at this point. All we're trying to do is validate these groupings. In terms of internationalization across these polities, also we find that there is greater internationalization in liberal pluralist countries compared to the other groupings. Similarly, if you look at collaboration with foreign co-inventors, which is again suggesting greater foreign collaboration or participation or co-optation, we find that those numbers are much greater for countries like the US and Canada, but they're also very high for countries like Norway and Sweden, which are social corporatist countries. So the extent to which foreign participation occurs is also relatively higher. In terms of technological impact across polities, we find that the greatest impact is being made by liberal, pluralist, and social corporatist countries. So these are countries which are large countries, like Bob said here. There is the US here, but the social corporatist countries are much smaller by contrast. Countries like Norway and Sweden are also having a very large impact in terms of the global innovation in this particular area, and this is based on the relative performance of cited scientific articles, or the extent to which articles are being cited from those countries. Yeah.
So then going back to the R&D, the two slides you had about research and development, are you saying then that the states that are more statist focus on research and development for their own internal production? Is that the outcome that they're looking for? And then dealing with the last two slides, it looks like then the more liberal ones are looking for production just...
Yes, and that would automatically, you could infer that, right? I mean, given that statist countries like Germany and France and Japan do tend to cultivate national champions and give primacy to domestic industries. In the case of Germany, it's mostly the automotive industry. In the case of France, it is a very specific type of mechanical device which is being manufactured, which is very, very novel, but it does not have very large-scale applications. So yes, given the fact that statist countries tend to be more closed and more directed and narrower, it is no surprise now that in terms of their global impact, we're seeing a much lower global impact in terms of performance. So yes, you're absolutely right in making that observation. So moving on, so having in a very, very simplistic way, without any sophisticated regressions, having validated the salience of this typology, I now move on to my case study, where I examine in greater detail the relevance of these polity types to the variations in the way fuel cell innovation proceeds. And I ask 4 questions. The first question is, how are public resources allocated? Now, what we find is that there isn't a lot of variation in terms of the amounts, the absolute amounts of public resources that are being allocated. It ranges anywhere from $250 million to about $300 million across countries like the US and Japan and even Norway. Surprisingly enough, even though it's a much smaller country, if you look at the contributions per capita, it's almost at par with, if you scale it, if you standardize it for the size of the country and its population, you will find that there is almost comparable investment being made in terms of public investments.
They have all that lovely oil money.
Yes, of course they have an interest in the oil money. But so I'm trying to kind of defend the small country effect here, in essence. And I'm saying that if you standardize it, even by the size of country, it's very comparable in terms of the levels of investments that are being made. But what is more interesting is the mechanism through which these public investments are being made. So what I've found as a result of this investigation is that in less statist countries, there is greater tendency for a variety of private investments. There is more venture capital, there's more corporate venture capital available in contrast to countries which are more statist. What is also interesting is that in terms of R&D investments in more statist countries, the bulk of it is coming from large private firms. Whereas in the less statist or more societal countries, you find that a lot of the investment is also coming from smaller firms, which are able to get that money from venture capitalists, and many of them have actually gone public. So there is a lot of reliance on public equity as well. Also, in terms of the nature of investments, what I found is that the government provides greater protection and helps in dealing with unexpected economic downturns as well as technological risks and uncertainties which a technology such as this is bound to bring with it. So there's greater protection that is provided to private investments in more statist countries. Also, what I find is that in more statist countries, there is a tendency to dole out resources based on selection rather than competition. So there is a greater tendency, for example, to choose national champions and then put together these consortia with these big companies in the lead. Whereas in less statist countries, the mechanism through which these investments, public investments, are made is based on competition rather than selection. So even for the smaller firms, there are several programs which allow for financial investments to be made to these firms. In terms of engagement with foreign actors, again, I find that there are systematic differences, and this difference is really based on the level of statism again, which is consistent with the liberal character. The more statist the country, the more closed it tends to be, the greater the tendency to shut off foreign participation. Even though Japanese firms have invested in projects in the US, such as the California Fuel Cell Partnership, and have set up several R&D units in California, it was not until a couple of years ago that US firms like General Motors was able to get into Japan and actually carry out innovation in Japan. So the less statist countries like the US have in fact been quite strategic. They have allowed a lot of foreign firms to come and participate within their national innovation system, and through that participation they have been able to gather a lot of knowledge in terms of the direction in which these firms are headed. One very well-known example being of Ballard Power Systems, which is a Canadian company which has operated in the US right from the beginning and has contributed a whole lot to the innovation that has gone on in the US. So to overcome the shackles of less foreign participation, of course, less firms from more statist countries have to internationalize more. So we find firms from France, for example, having to set up their R&D units in various countries, send their inventors and scientists to various countries to co-locate with the R&D labs of other auto manufacturers, for instance. How much time do I have, Bob?
Well, we go until 2.
Okay.
So if you want time for questions, probably.
Okay.
That's okay.
All right. So I think I should be in good time, and I can take a breath or two. My third question was about the nature of partnerships involving public and private actors. So we know that collaboration is at the center of it all. I mean, it's really very much encompassing, and it is to be found across all of these different polity types. But what is the nature of these partnerships, and how do they differ across these polity types? Is there any systematic variation? And what I find is that in more corporatist countries like Japan and Norway, the participation tends to be more inclusive. Almost the entire industry is organized in addressing a single project or a single innovation problem which is presented to them. So, these networks are in fact very well coordinated, oftentimes by the METI, which is the Ministry for Economic Trade and Industry, and these networks are also very hierarchically organized, with one firm playing the main pivotal role as the coordinator on behalf of the government. By contrast, in less corporatist countries, we find that these networks tend to be very fragmented, the alliances tend to be more opportunistic, and the learning that firms expect is far more deliberate. These partnerships are also most often initiated by the firms themselves rather than orchestrated by a central coordinating actor like the government. So the nature of participation is also quite fundamentally different, even if we take a meso-level view of the industry. So, and that difference is evident across the levels of corporatism. The fourth question that is, again, relevant to a new industry is the extent of technological diversity. What is the extent of technological diversity that we are seeing across these countries? And again, we find systematic differences. In more corporatist countries, we find the technological direction to be fairly narrower. compared to less corporatist countries, where the principles of competition and technological neutrality and pluralism lead to far greater technological choices than in more corporatist countries where there is greater evidence of targeted technology development. If we take the case of Norway, for example, like Bob said a little while ago, most of this technology development is in the area of hydrogen-based fuel cells. There is some evidence of solid oxide fuel cell development as well, but most of the industry is really organized towards the development of hydrogen-based technologies, which is consistent with the fact that there is a large oil industry, and these interests organize themselves, in a well-coordinated and in a tightly integrated manner to develop the technology. And they are also reaping the benefits of that, as we saw from the earlier slide, in terms of the impact that countries like Norway are making on the rest of the world in terms of their innovation. So to summarize the variations across these polities, across these 4 policy dimensions, we find that the competitive allocation of public resources tends to be far greater in both liberal pluralist and social corporatist countries compared to state nation or state corporatist countries, where the allocation of resources is really based on the criteria of selection rather than competition. Also in terms of engagement with foreign actors, this research suggests that there is greater engagement with foreign actors in liberal pluralist and social corporatist settings when compared to state nation or state corporatist settings. So the defining feature here is really the level of statism. When it comes to partnerships involving public and private actors, what I find is that there is a much higher degree of participation and far more encompassing relationships in the more corporatist settings compared to the less corporatist settings, and here corporatism is really the defining feature. And finally, when it comes to technological diversity, there's far greater technological diversity in liberal pluralist and state nation settings, which is consistent with the societal and the pluralist nature of society when compared with the social corporatist and state corporatist settings, which tend to be more tightly integrated and closed network settings. So what does all this mean for knowledge creation in terms of strengths and weaknesses? In terms of knowledge creation strengths, what we find, and these are again implications, and they have not been tested empirically, and some of my papers now are actually working on carrying out empirical tests. So these are implications which have been drawn out from the observations which have been made based on systematic comparison of these polities. So what I would suggest is that in terms of knowledge creation strengths, liberal pluralist countries have a large range of investment options, including venture capital or internal corporate venturing and so on. It also favors greater diversity of ideas and experimentation, and these are all positive attributes from a knowledge creation perspective. We can get a lot of novel knowledge as a result of the investments that are being made by those who are relatively more willing to invest in risky enterprise and experimentation. There's also this more deliberate approach to learning, which is based on the competitive spirit. It is based on the spirit of maximizing individual interests rather than collective gains or collective benefits, which kind of tend to promote these enduring relationships. So it's really not more as deliberate as we might expect in liberal pluralist settings. But in terms of knowledge creation weakness, we might expect that greater competition and propensity for risky investments will lead to multiple innovations that will never see the light of day. So you'll find several technologies which would be perhaps a waste of resource at the end of the day, because there is no protracted targeted investment which is being made. So experimentation and novelty would be the upside, but on the downside, you may see a lot of companies going belly up because the technology that they've invested in is not really going to pay them off. Or companies might worry about takeovers, which has been the case in fuel cells, because they have this valuable technology which big companies want to appropriate for themselves. When it comes to state nations, the concentration of resources can definitely lead to these targeted innovations, and there is less slack in terms of the investments that are being made. But these narrowly defined technological paths which are determined by the government may not have large-scale global application. Also, the selective criteria through which investments are made in these countries can lead to the disenfranchisement of small firms. So even though large firms in countries like France have benefited from government investments, the smaller firms are going to, for the large part, be left out of this process. In social corporatist countries, greater participation of private sector and a supportive role of government also helps in knowledge creation that is consistent with their capabilities. The premature